Hello and welcome to The Truth About Storytelling. This is Tyreen Martinson. I'm a poet, podcaster, author, and I recently returned from a trip to Mongolia. So for the month of September, I am focused on reflections from that trip on Mondays, fast facts about Mongolia on Wednesdays, and a writing episode on Fridays that kind of comes from that trip and also has some writing prompts to encourage writers. And today is a Friday, so today is a writing episode. So as I shared earlier this week in both my reflections and in my fast facts, horses are an important part of life in Mongolia. Cows, yaks, sheep, goats, and camels are also important parts of life in Mongolia, but horses are celebrated because many herdsmen actually start riding horses at a very young age. About 30 to 40% of the population of Mongolia still practices herding as part of their way of life. So there are a number of herdsmen who still practice that way of life. They support their country by actually providing a lot of meat for the country. Yes, that's how they make their living. But it is a backbone of Mongolian life. It's a staple of Mongolian food to eat mutton, goat, cows, and yak butter. So it's very important, a very important part of Mongolian life. And it really made me think about a couple of different things when I write my fantasy novels and for just writing in general. Because there are different ways that Mongolians handle their herding practices than we do here in the United States or in other parts of the world. In Mongolia, people put up fences around their houses and around their towns while the animals roam free. So if you're in Mongolia and you see horses, cows, sheep, goats on the side of the road, they are not wild. They are all owned by a herding family. They may have a microchip, they may have a brand, but they are all owned by a herding family. They are not just wild. They're not just out there randomly. They're not looking for someone to pick them up and adopt them. They have owners, but they roam freely and they graze freely. The herdsmen move them from summer pasture lands to winter pasture lands every single year. So they get a variety of food from place to place, and they are taken care of as best as they can be. There are sheep herding dogs that are huge sheep herding dogs that help in this process. Many of the herdsmen ride horses to help herd their animals. There are also herdsmen who ride motorcycles to help in their herding process. But horses are actually still the best way for herders to maintain their herds, because sometimes there are gas shortages, so motorcycles are not always the best thing for them to use. So thinking about that and thinking about the fact that I write fantasy and science fiction, so sometimes I write about places that are different worlds, and also how this could apply to like historical fiction, I started thinking about the fact that, so in my fantasy worlds, many of my characters get around on horseback because I write about these medieval worlds that they live in, where that's the main mode of transportation along with ships. And again, because it's fantasy, sometimes a griffin, sometimes a dragon, sometimes there are other modes or magical creature type transportations, but mainly they get around on horses. And so seeing the Mongolian people care for their horses and really love their horses, being asked by a 12-year-old herding boy to pray for his horse because he wanted to make sure his horse stayed strong through the winter, and that he was also concerned about wolves, because when they move their herds to the winter pasture lands, they have to fight off wolves and keep them away from their herds and their horses. And so he was very concerned about his horse. He loves his horse. His horse is a huge part of his life. He's been riding that horse probably since he was about 4 years old. And so I was thinking about that and how in my fantasy stories, generally, my characters just ride their horses and they care for them, but I don't really get into that very much because I'm not really a horsewoman. I have a niece who is a horsewoman. I have a great niece who's a horse girl, a great nephew who's probably becoming a horse guy. And so I know people who really truly love horses. One of my sister-in-law laws has taken in retired horses and really cared for them in their older age. So again, I know people who really love horses. I have ridden on horseback, but I know that I don't know the depth of caring for horses the way that many other people do. And yet I do have horses in my fantasy story. So I've been thinking about how I can make my characters' lives with their horses a little more authentic. I may, at some point in a future fantasy series, have a little bit of a closer relationship with one of my characters and their horses, because I think that that makes sense. If this is an animal that you have raised and that you have used every single day of your life for transportation, and you are in a constant relationship with them in a way, you are going to have a different depth of feeling for them than, say, maybe I do with my car. And I have to admit, I really like my car. So my car has a name. I mean, it's not the same at all as a living creature, but yet I still enjoy driving my car. And so I can imagine if you have a horse, you have a much deeper relationship with it than you do a car, which is not living. So again, thinking about that, thinking about how I might add more depth to my characters and maybe more conflict to my stories because of characters who care for their horses that they use every single day of their lives, and trying to show that more in my stories. So instead of just treating horses as like, oh yes, this is how they get from one place to another, and not really discussing it much in my stories as I have in the past. So that might be something that I change in the future. And it's something that I highly recommend that you consider changing if you write fantasy or you write historical fiction where horses are the main mode of transportation. How do your characters interact with them? Are they in a caring relationship with these animals that they are with every single day, who they care for and who carry them from one place to another? I think it makes sense for them to have a deep relationship with the animals that they care for and the animals that take them from one place to another. So anyway, something to think about, some food for thought there for those of you who write fantasy or historical fiction, or maybe even science fiction. If a science fiction world has some kind of creature that your characters interact with on a daily or regular basis. So another thing I was thinking about with all of this is the fact that they are free-ranging animals. And here in America, we have kind of sided on the side of farmers. We started fencing animals in, I don't even know when. I'm going to say at least 100 years ago, probably more like 150 years ago. We started putting up more fences, so that way there were animals that were basically corralled within fenced areas, so that way farmers wouldn't get their crops trampled or eaten by cows, horses, etc., sheep and goats. Sorry. Wow, that was whoops. Linguistically, I know that sheep is both plural and singular, but for some reason I said sheeps a few minutes ago. So there you have it. I do make mistakes when I speak, but when a community decides that they're going to fence one particular way of life and not the other, there is definitely an interesting choice being made there. Now, again, I grew up in America. I've grown up in the areas where we fence our animals. We might fence our yards as well, but fencing our yards is kind of seen as a personal choice. You might fence your yard, you might not. You might fence your garden, you might not. But typically, it's a rule that people have to fence in their herds of animals. If they have cows or sheep or goats or emus or whatever they raise, they have to have a fence around them to keep them from getting out, to keep them from trampling other people's gardens or eating other people's gardens. And so we, as a society in America, kind of sided with farmers. and with those of us who don't have a farm but we just have a house and yard. So we sided with people who don't have animals as far as how we handle our fencing restrictions and our fencing laws. But in Mongolia, the animals roam free and the people build up fences around their houses and yards and around their businesses to keep the animals out. So it's seen as the property owner's responsibility to keep the animals out of the yard or the garden. And the animals, again, are allowed to roam freely. So this is a really different choice that's been made by Mongolian people than the choice that's been made here in America to fence in animals and keep them out of people's yards or gardens. And I mean, I really think about that. It's a very different choice. And it makes me think about what that means for a society as a whole. And I don't only mean in Mongolia and America. I mean, if you're imagining a fictionalized world or a fantasy world or a sci-fi world, or even looking at historical fiction when people were making decisions like that, what does it mean? How does it affect people? What kind of conflict does it cause when people are choosing to fence gardens or fence animals? And who chooses in the long run? Who makes that choice? Is it individuals? Is it a government? Does someone force other people to follow their rules about what's being fenced and what isn't? And it's an interesting idea to really kind of toss around and think about, and be interesting to think about, I think, in a fictional or fantasy or sci-fi setting, because you can really play around with all the different ways that scenario could play out, all the different type of conflicts that could come from it, and even maybe the way people talk about things, the different words that they might have in a specific language to talk about different concepts about freedom and responsibility and what that looks like. Do they fence things in? Does someone sit on a fence if they're undecided? How does that all play out into the words that we use to describe the conflicts and the resolutions that we find to those conflicts? And it's just interesting because I think about just that cliche, good fences make better neighbors. Interesting. It's definitely an American statement, right? And yet, I don't know that people in Mongolia would say the same thing. I don't even know that people in the United Kingdom would say the same thing, because if you've ever been to the United Kingdom, you know that you can hike across someone's yard or hike across someone's field. Now, it's then on your responsibility to make sure you don't get injured by a shepherding dog that is keeping its sheep safe, that you don't get injured by a cow or a bull that might be keeping its herd safe. But you can walk across a farmer's field. They have these ways that you can walk through or over the fence to hike through. And that's not usually done in America. It is done in some places, but it's pretty rare here. And most people are really fierce about their idea of personal property here in America. And that goes for farmers, especially if they're concerned about their animals. In Mongolia, even though you might see horses, yaks, and cows seemingly grazing all by themselves on the side of the road or off in a pasture land, they are all owned by herding families. They all have brands or microchips, and they are protected because they protect one another in their herds, and there are always sheepdogs around, and those sheepdogs are pretty big sheepdogs. They're at least waist high to me. I am short, I will admit that, but they're at least waist high to me. They have really big heads, and while they were always well behaved when we were around them because their owners were with them, I'm not sure I would want to tangle with one of those sheepdogs if they thought they were protecting their herd from me. So even in Mongolia, even though they don't have fenced flocks and herds, they definitely have ways that those animals are protected and people are expected to kind of leave them alone, other than maybe shooing them off the sidewalk to get by them. And so it's interesting because, again, it's a different expectation, a different way of life of how animals are herded and handled, but they are still cared for. It's just not, it doesn't look the same as it does here in America and in other places where animals are fenced into large pasture lands or small pasture lands. So it's an interesting thing to see the differences and to really think about them and think about how those could play out in a story, either set in the real world or set in a fictional world, how we could really think about what it means to have personal property. I mean, that's another thing that kind of comes out of all of this, thinking about the way herds are handled in different places around the world. For me, I think, okay, so how do we handle personal property? And how would that play out in a fictional world? And could it be a source of great conflict? Because it definitely can, right? We definitely have different political ideas about personal property, and we definitely have different social mores around personal property in different places. So it's something to kind of think about how we handle that in our fiction, in our writing, what we think about it, how we want to portray it in our fiction and in our storytelling. It's just kind of an interesting source of potential conflict, and conflict always drives story. Even if it's a small story or a short story or two people are just having coffee at a diner, there's always some sort of conflict, even if it's a small type of conflict. And that's why there's a resolution in a story, because there's conflict and there's resolution. Now, resolution in a story may not mean that everyone ends up happily, because you end up with stories like Hamlet where a lot of people die. And so the resolution does not look like a resolution. It doesn't look like a solution to a problem, although kind of it is, because again, a lot of people die, and then the only people left are those who actually want to have peaceful relationships. So you could say there is a solution to the problem in that story as well. But in any story, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. There is a setting, there's character, there's conflict of some kind, even if the conflict is that character trying to survive in a world where they are faced with cold or starvation or something such like that. But there's always conflict, there's always resolution. And things like how we handle the animals that we care for in our lives, whether they are our domesticated dogs and cats, or they are herds of cattle, sheep, goats, or a beloved horse that carries us everywhere we go, how we handle those animals, how we handle our relationships, how we handle personal property, how we handle the idea of fences, whether or not we have them and why we have them. Those are all great places for conflict, all great places for stories to really take place. And it's kind of interesting because I think you could have some interesting discussions between characters who maybe aren't super involved in, say, herding animals or taking care of animals, but if they came from two different societies, one in which fenced in animals and the other one in which did not fence in animals, they might have very different points of view about other things in life and how they handle those other things in life. You could feel free to explore that in any way you can, because I just think it's a fascinating thing to think about. And again, it could be really fascinating to write about and include in our storytelling, whether they be historical fiction, suspense fiction, thriller fiction, romantic fiction, fantasy fiction, sci-fi fiction, or even nonfiction, where we explore some of those ideas and how they play out in the real world. So thank you for joining me today. This is Tyreen Martinson with The Truth About Storytelling. Today is more of a storytelling episode. Next week, I will have one more long, rambly reflection about my trip to Mongolia, one more set of Mongolian facts that I will share with you, one more set of writing prompts and writing ideas that come from my trip to Mongolia. And then after that, for the rest of October and through November, I will be talking primarily about writing fantasy fiction, and specifically about writing my book trilogy, the Darkblade trilogy, and the world that it's set in, which is a world in which I intend to build several trilogies. I already have another trilogy set in that world. So I'll be mainly focused on all of that for October and November, and I'll also be starting to talk about a Kickstarter campaign involving Darkblade. So this is actually the first time you'll hear me talk about that. I am doing a Kickstarter campaign for the first book in the Darkblade trilogy. It's going to be a special edition. It's going to be beautiful. Yes, the first book's already out there in paperback and ebook, but this will be a special edition hardback with some extras and some fun stuff. And I'll also be putting out a special edition of book 2 alongside it. So get ready for that. If you're on any of my social media channels or on my newsletter, you may have already heard about it in more detail. So get ready, because I will definitely be talking about that in October and November as I talk about writing fantasy fiction. So thank you for joining me today. I will see you or chat at you next week.